LSD does all kinds of strange things to your mind and perception, but it is somewhat reluctant to produce what I call true hallucinations. It will do that if you smoke a lot of cannabis on top of it, or lace a little mescaline on top of it. But pure LSD is somewhat reluctant to do what I'm after. And what I'm after are visions. These unfolding, visually beheld, incredibly complex, beautiful, meaning-laden scenarios. I didn't feel satisfaction in my pursuit of that till I got to psilocybin. So that's why I do it at night. And I
mentioned music.
Music, good point. And again, I take a harder line than most people. I listen to music on ayahuasca, especially because often it's being generated by human beings, and because ayahuasca has a tradition of music being visibly beheld. But when I take psilocybin or anything else like that, I don't play music because it's complete sensory overload. It absolutely dominates the experience. Now, if I were to take mushrooms and at the 2-hour mark, nothing whatsoever has happened, I might put on some music to try and coax it out of the woodwork. But at the 2-hour mark, it should already be raging. Something has happened. Either you're full of food or the dose went off or something. So I find, see, what I'm interested in is the thing in itself, the ding on sich of it. What is it without music, without nature, without input from other people? What is it in silent darkness? And people say, well, especially people who've meditated, say, well, that sounds hideously boring. Not at all, my friend. You will have your hands so full in absolutely silent darkness if it works, that at 1 iota more of input would be unbearable. So I tend to advise against music. Also, know your music. I have had experiences where my goal in life became to survive to the end of the cut. You know, music is a magical art. And, you know, you just drop something on the turntable, and God knows what the motivation of this was. Yeah.
Ego infused in that, and sort of trying to persuade you in some way to. It's definitely insidious.
Well, and the art of music is to work on emotional modes. And here's a guy who wrote a piece of music, and his intent was for it to emotionally take people to pieces. Well, maybe you didn't know that was his intent, but you drop it on the turntable. Well, now.
That's the advantage of a companion, though, because if you're under it, you don't want to be changing CDs.
No, if you're going to listen to music, you definitely need somebody to run the machinery, I think. Yeah. Barry?
The other thing with music, on the other side of it, music tends to, maybe just because I grew up in the 60s, but it brings back memories of the past. There's associations, there's emotional entanglements, associations, and you're there again. You may not want to be in the past. You may want to be free of those kinds of associations. That's one of the problems I've found. The other thing is that I was talking to a friend of mine who wants to purge a tape, and a newfound friend that said that they wanted to try the mushroom, but she said that, and I've heard this before from people on the radio, that they think it's going to be like LSD, and they don't want to go inside and go through all this introspection where kind of LSD has that psychoanalytic edge to it, and go into their heads and especially if they may be, in a depression or things are not going well, they don't want to take it, and they feel like they have to be sort of liberated from all their problems before they can take it, because they don't want to get into any dark, deep places. When you say you're after hallucinations, is it more external and it doesn't matter what your psychic state is inside?
No, we've dealt with setting. Now let's move, following your question, to set. No, that is the question. What should you be like before you take it? And again, opinions differ. In my opinion, you should be in a state of reasonable psychic equilibrium. You should. I know it ain't easy. It's how many seconds a year do you qualify? But nevertheless, like for instance, I would never take it in the middle of some incredible emotional upheaval with my partner or something like that, because it's just crazy making. So you sort of have to have things a little calm down. And then what I always do, and this is just my preference, and it's just my preference, is I always throw the Ching. And because it's saying, okay, I think I'm ready, I think the set is okay, I think the setting is okay, now let's get some input. And the I Ching, a surprising number of times, I've thrown the hexagram, I can't remember which one it is, it's the only one that says, inquire again of the oracle if you possess constancy and something else. So in other words, if the auguries are negative, I don't proceed with it. Then another issue we haven't dealt with, but sort of back on the other side, is inside or outside. And people say to me, you don't do it outside, you don't do it in nature. Well, at the quantum mechanical level, there's even nature inside my apartment. Nature is everywhere. It's space, time, and energy. It would be nice, I agree, and when I take it in nature, I take lower doses for two reasons. First of all, I'm going to work largely with my eyes open. I'm going to be looking at things. A nature trip is a looking at things trip. And the other reason I take low doses in nature is because sure as hell some wild hair thing is going to happen. You're going to be taken prisoner by naked people, or a ranger is going to ride up and demand what is going on, or just the crazy things that go on, unless you happen to own several hundred acres of nature that's well patrolled, and then you can maybe have some confidence you won't be bothered. I know somebody who took LSD and was in nature somewhere in the Hunt country of Virginia and found themselves being booted off the property by Jackie O. I couldn't have stood that myself. So, and so I do it inside. And then the other thing I do, and again, it's just years of experience, but my preference and relates to my other drug habits, is I always have cannabis, and ready, rolled and ready. And it's navigational aids. I use it in two situations. If the state is reluctant to appear, usually a large hit or two of cannabis will carry it through. Or if you get into some place that is completely intolerable, you can do a number of things to shift your physiological equilibrium, but the least obtrusive and disruptive is to just smoke cannabis. And then the third application of cannabis in that situation is if you have come over the peak and are started down and you still want to stay up there, cannabis will usually somewhat extend the situation.
So again, what would you say to people who say, LSD drives me crazy? I go through these incredible moral dilemmas.
And say, don't take it.
Yeah, don't take it.
I'm tearing my psyche out with my fingernails, and I don't want that. I want the I don't want to have to go inside like that. I want.
No, I think LSD is abrasively psychoanalytic.
So, mushroom DMT could be more outer directed to hallucination.
No, it seems like this to me, that somehow LSD talks about who you are, and maybe that's good and maybe that's bad. Psilocybin doesn't care who you are. It has a message it will deliver to any human being who shows up with their hand out, and it doesn't care who you are. So and DMT, it's so brief. The idea of formulating and dealing with a personal dilemma in DMT, it would have to be some really overwhelming dilemma, because it's just saying, no, look at the view, this is about the Grand Canyon, not the tourist who's visiting the Grand Canyon.
There's another aspect of psilocybin I find almost every time I do it, I get incredibly telepathic. I start having conversations with people that aren't physically there.
Or if they are physically there, you can hear them in your mind.
And then it's almost like there have been times when it feels like we're on the same energy wave, and we're both riding it simultaneously.
Yeah, all of these things go on. And, simple rules that should be obvious, like don't, clean your apartment before you get loaded. I mean, it's a symbolic gesture. Oh, for cleaning it? We'll take them, clean it, come down, then trip. I don't mean clean it while you're loaded. No. That would be.
If you smoke marijuana, like you say, as a Buddhist, you're going to want to clean, and you'll end up remodeling the whole house before the day's over.
Well, it may be the only creative thing you've done that month. So, basically, I think you can tell from this conversation, it's something you learn your way into. It's very complicated. You have many drugs, many sets, many settings, many dosages, conceivably even some combinations, although I'm not big on combinations.
I was going to say that alcohol is not a very good ally with psychedelic substances in my eyes. I mean, people do that later coming down at the end of the trip having a beer or something, or, light alcohol is a different thing, but people, they get drunk and it makes it...
Yeah, I would never do that.
Twisted, uncomfortable situation.
What about Hamlet with your
That's a controversial thing. A number of people do it. One of the hardest evenings I ever spent was that combination. And I will never do that again. But I haven't been able to line up too much support. The question is, what about combining Pagamen harmala with mushrooms, with Stropharia cubensis? Now, what happened to me was I took half a dose of mushrooms, which for me would be 2.5 grams. I took 2.5 grams of mushrooms with half a dose of ayahuasca. And it seemed crazy-making to me. Very, very, very unpleasant state. I think what was happening as I analyzed it later was that short-term memory absolutely would not transcript. And so I got into this strange loop which went like this. Something's wrong. What's wrong?
Oh, God.
Nothing's wrong. Okay. Something's wrong. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Okay. And it was serious, and it went on for about an hour, and I just did not know what to do. I had the image from 2001 of the guy outside the ship saying, "Open the pod doors, Hal." Saying, "I can't do that, Dave." "Open the pod doors, Hal." "I'm sorry, Dave." And it really seemed to me, I could almost see an enzymatic, I almost had like a nano-engineer's view of the problem. I could see at the synaptic level that the molecular machinery was lodged in some peculiar configuration, and I was broke into a sweat, and I just said, "Okay, I'm going to sit here till this goes away. I'm not going to start screaming. I'm not going to call for help. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to wait until this goes away." And then I started deep breathing as a strategy for metabolizing. And after 45 minutes or so, it kind of jiggled loose, and then it was like, "Oh, huh. Oh, wow, what a bummer that was."
Now I know how Reagan feels all the time.
Yeah, that's what it's like. It's a nightmare. Kathleen?
I think that mixing is an effort to force a certain kind of content that we get addicted to. And I've come to believe that the visions and the content are not as important as how the neocortex is touched neurochemically. And that the way that's touched, I can carry that into my everyday life, and that's more important to me than a certain experience set at a certain time frame.
Yeah, although I think the experience is the signifier of that state that you're talking about. I mean, you do want to come out of it with a sense of relief and accomplishment. I mean, it's sort of like orgasm, you know. There must be release of some sort, and a sense of, we did well, we came through, we learned something, we're back, we're ready to go forward with ordinary life, we won't forget, we affirm, we praise and offer thanksgiving, that kind of thing. To the universe in all its diversity and complexity, that such a confluence of fortuitous elements could occur, that such a synergy to higher consciousness could even be possible. You know, Aldous Huxley called the psychedelic experience, he called it a gratuitous grace. He said it is neither necessary nor sufficient for salvation. Neither necessary nor sufficient, but it certainly makes it easier. So it's like a gift. It's like the universe is giving you 20 points at the beginning of the game just to help you along.
If that's too highfalutin, then you just praise Bugs Bunny and Patrick Swayze.
The reason I asked, you mentioned 2001, and Arthur C. Clarke has completed 3001 about 6 months ago, and I bought it, and it's kind of, he writes extremely dull, but he indicates that by 3001, man has come to the understanding that any thoughts of a creator was just superstition. And I found that very refreshing, because that's how I've felt for a long time. That's why
a creator. Yeah. Well, you know, the universe is its own creator. I mean, the universe is some kind of autopoetic, it's an autopoetic process. If there is a goal in the universe, it's built into every move it makes. I don't see an intellect outside of space and time guiding things, and certainly not watching with bated breath the machinations of the human monkeys. I mean, nobody has time for that kind of thing. So the universe is a self-creating mystery of some sort. And mystery should not be heard as unsolved problem. It's not an unsolved problem. It's a mystery. It's completely ever renewing itself right in front of you. Life teaches this if you're paying attention. Psychedelics almost rub your nose in it. Yeah.
Terence, I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship between the psychedelic state at hallucination and rationality, because you say you're a rationalist. This is an interesting question for me, especially in terms of bringing, as you said before, the object is to bring something back. Well, you can have the visions, but if you're going to bring it back, then you have to go through some sort of thought process that is closer to left brain thinking. I'm sorry, left brain thinking, than the full-blown, consciousness expanded.
You mean you have to reduce it to its elements?
Yeah. So, when you say you're a rationalist, it's an odd kind of rationality. I wonder if you could talk about that, because I think I see what you mean, but your rationality, your reason, is more like a supercharged thought process that's the syntax of its logic is closer to poesis and a poetic process like Plato would have, his kind of thoughts, than it is, So would you talk about the relationship where rationality kicks in and what that's all about?
Well, when I say I'm a rationalist, I mean that I guess I trust but verify. Everything is to be tested. Nothing is to be taken at face value. Certainly nothing is to be believed in. The reason I even found psychedelics was because I was following rumors of a effective force for spiritual breakthrough. And when I followed it to its source, there was spiritual breakthrough. At other times, I followed other rumors of spiritual breakthrough, and when I got to the source, I found a public relations agent and a con artist or something like that. Reason is simply the desire that things have some kind of local logic adhering to them. I mean, if the universe is not rational, it's also not discussable. And, maybe the universe isn't rational, but in that case, this discussion and all others have been completely superfluous. Reason is not to be confused with scientific method. Scientific method is a very locally generated cultural artifact with a very limited intent. But reason is the idea that A is not B, here is not there. Now, of course, you can say, well, this kind of reason breaks down in quantum physics. Yes, but then there's much dancing around the campfire about that. And still somehow reason remains a player even in the presence of non-reason, because it's measured back against the standard of reason.
Question: when you're in this full-blown experience, is there some element, however vestigial, present, or is it just totally gone? And then how do you translate from that non-speakable state to being a scholar, being able to communicate it rationally? How does that work?
Well, I think you have to have a lot of metaphors gathered on this side of the frontier. In other words, someone who's never been anywhere, never read anything, never done anything is going to have a much harder time with DMT than someone who can command the complete canon of Western art, can refer to certain mathematical objects, knows certain musical forms, is familiar with structural linguistics, has a working knowledge of geology. In other words, your intellectual toolkit needs to be full of adjectives, metaphors, models, and possibilities. And then you can say of DMT, well, it was like the Sistine Chapel altar, except that instead of the kind of light you get in Caravaggio or somebody like that, there was a kind of, the sort of thing Matthias Grunewald is doing in his Resurrection, where if somebody doesn't know what any of this is, they're having a kind of DMT experience of their own just listening to you. Because they say, what did he say? What does he say? What? But if you know what you mean and speak precisely, all these words have meaning. Sistine Chapel altar, light like Caravaggio, modified as the way Grunewald did it, and so forth and so on. So somehow it's still an incredible flattening. I don't mean that this is an adequate tool. I mean it's a tool. I am perfectly aware that the most high-flown and hysteria-provoking descriptions of DMT I've ever been able to summon up in front of a group were complete betrayals of the real thing. So not what it was that the word lie is almost applicable. But it's the best I can do. And that's why I have said this morning, this idea of building the internet as a net for capturing the alien mind. If we go into the internet and I build the weirdest and most mind-boggling virtual reality I can imagine, and then turn it over to you, and you come in and add your filigrees, adumbrations, cupolas, and what have you, and then we hand it over to you, and you do the same. By now, this thing has gotten pretty weird. Just this intensification of weirdness, slowly we can build up an image of it. But I don't think a single person could possibly have the breadth and depth of experience to do it alone. Maybe a Thomas Pynchon or someone like that. But we're involved in a communication struggle here. We're trying to describe the unspeakable. We're trying to literally move the boundaries of what can be said and what can't be said. We're trying to push the frontiers of what can be said deeper into the domain of the unspeakable. And are we succeeding or failing? Well, that's for each one of us to judge. I know every time I smoke DMT, the first emotion I have as it fully establishes itself in my sensorium is that I have the sense of remembering what it really is and having this sort of guilt/embarrassment about realizing how hideously unfaithful I am to the truth of it. This truth can't be told, or at least not by me. I've been trying for 20 years, and I have created an object in discourse that fascinates people. But is it DMT? No, it's me doing the best I can with DMT. But I have the faith that this is not an intrinsic quality of it. It's not in principle beyond description. It's that doing it by bursting in on it, looking around, then coming down, then raving about it is a very difficult method, you know. A better method would be to incrementally, piece by piece, try to build a model that you could go back to in various states of mind. I mean, for instance, here's a frontier no one has crossed yet. Let's build the best model of the DMT flash we can build. Then let's smoke DMT inside that model and conduct a review of how we're doing. By such methods as this, we will sooner or later push the thing into greater and greater, into the light, where we can see it.
And you've been able to take more back from your psilocybin experiences simply because you could stay there longer. And you've been able to take back from the DMT experience, although the DMT experience was like the compass that really showed you this is where it's at.
Not only was I able to stay longer, but the state itself is easier to describe. It has elements of the DMT flash, but certain of the harder elements to describe aren't present. For example, on psilocybin, you hear a voice, or I hear a teaching voice. On DMT, I see who makes that voice. Well, now a voice is, yes, same voice. The voice is not hard to get used to. It's saying astonishing things, but that's all. It's just saying astonishing things, but it's speaking in English, and it is a voice. When you encounter the speaker as an image, you can't even think about what's being said because your jaw hangs in air in the presence of who is saying it. And you basically say, you know, I don't want to hear what you're saying. I want to look at you.
You're saying you don't really get all the way there or as far as you can go unless you do DMT.
Just, it seems that there is some kind of synaptic saturation happening there or something like that. Yeah, I have heard, and I have no reason to believe it, that I've never overdosed on mushrooms or felt that I've overdosed. I've taken some enormous unweighed batches, but I've never felt that I had overdosed. But people have described to me what goes on above 35 milligrams of chemical psilocybin. And basically what people say is the hallucinations condense and freeze. And that's sounding very DMT-like. Indeed, I would suppose, and strange that we have no reports of this in the literature. I have no idea why not. But it would seem to me one could smoke psilocybin. It's not pyrolyzed. It would work. If you had chemical psilocybin and you smoked 35 milligrams of it, I'll bet you it would be very, very, very much like DMT. And why should DMT present this benchmark? I don't know. I suppose it's simply, here we have a series of compounds which elicit different effects. There's going to be one that in the nature of things will be inclusive, and this is it. Now the salvanorine raises different issues. On one level, almost theological issues. You know, is this town big enough for two forms of weirdness that are apparently not the same? In other words, it took me a long time to get used to the idea that there could be one exception to the onrushing momentum of reality. The idea that alpha salvanorine is a second dispensation from reality raises the question, 3, 4, 50, 500, 10,000? Maybe reality is a far more perishable concept than we ever dared or feared to suppose.
I had an experience on that wondering, it sort of baffled me. I had never done it before, and I was at Timothy Leary's house, and the Lily, is that the dolphin guy? His assistant was there, and he had some, and I thought they were snorting coke, which I thought was kind of crappy. And they go, no, it's ketamine, do you want to try some? And I go, okay. And
they wished they had coke.
And anyway, there was like a few people there, and what happened is I separated from my body, and I was like over here, and my body was here. But somebody came up to me who I only met once or twice and started making conversation with my body. And I, over here, but I, over here, was in possession of my mind. Calmly, thought, process, But I, with my mind over here, watched my body go through this whole rigmarole with this person and make social conversation. Hello, how are you? Why, certainly, all this stuff. And I watched myself, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out how, because I knew I had my brain over here. So the brain that was playing the game over here was like something else. But yet it was my facial muscles were smiling when it was appropriate to smile. My physical body did everything exactly as it was supposed to, but yet I wasn't participating one dot and didn't have any interest in participating. And I don't know, that was just so interesting to me because my mind was definitely not running that show, the physical show.
Well, I think that's why they call it a dissociative anesthetic. I mean, it does disassociate. You literally are beside yourself. You can't get much more disassociated than that. Yeah.
Terence, have you ever audio taped yourself under the influence of DMT?
Oh, yeah. I did early on, did all that. See, I thought I pursued this glossolalia that is induced by DMT, and I thought that if I could hear it for years before I could physically articulate it, and I thought that this glossolalia had some kind of magical property, and that if I could articulate it in the world, something definitive would occur, or people would become interested in it or not. And it's that on DMT, some people, and I'm one of them, speak in strange languages spontaneously. They don't even, in some cases, know they're doing it. They just seem to fall into this. And it's ecstatic to do. For some reason, this is just it's what you want to do. It seems to be the obvious thing to do, to speak in this peculiar way. And at first I heard it for years, moving so fast. It was like, I called it elf chatter. And then, I don't know why, diligent prayer or something was able to slow it down, and I found I could do it. And I went out to Hawaii years ago and took a voice-activated tape recorder, and I spent a week. I took 8 grams of mushrooms every night, nearly every night for a week, and made these recordings. And what I came down with were these recordings which people find extremely alarming to listen to. They hear it and they just are convinced. They're not like, it's not like, well, it just makes people think you're crazy. They just say, okay, so you were sitting in a tent halfway up a mountain all by yourself, and what you chose to do was shriek in Nostratic for some reason. Now, I still think that the secret of the psychedelics, or the point of all this, has to do with the language. That, first of all, language, ordinary language, as we are using it here is a very bizarre behavioral pattern. I mean, when you deconstruct it and think about it, first of all, just notice other animals don't do this. Dolphins, honeybees aside, they don't do what we do. There are no Miltons among the honeybees, I think. So what's happening is we have thoughts. We want to share these thoughts. We have evolved a system where the thoughts are transduced into mouth noises, small mouth noises, which are conventionally assigned meaning. In other words, inside the context of a culture, book means book in English. Book does not mean this in some other language. It may mean something else, food, sex, or death. We assign sound signatures to meaning. We then make these sounds with our mouths. A pressure wave moves acoustically through the air. It enters the ear of the intended listener. The listener also has a dictionary acquired through cultural convention. The incoming acoustical signals are downloaded. The dictionary is looking them up. If the dictionaries match, then we say understanding is taking place. No two dictionaries are exact. And in fact, one of the uncoolest things you can do in most social situations is to say to someone, would you explain to me what I just said? It usually brings the party to a screeching halt because the world is really running on, yeah, oh yeah, well, yeah. And when you break that illusion of grunts and say, no, I just said something quite complicated. Would you please iterate it for me with fidelity? Most people can't do this at all. So we have a problem. We possess language. We've built a world out of language. But our language it's like using 300 baud modems to try and run an internet or something. It's so squeezed that we can barely get anything across. Well, then you go into the DMT space, and here is language which you don't listen to, but which you see. The DMT creatures generate topologies, colored, moving, self-transforming surfaces that are laden, God knows how, with meaning. Not conventional meaning, because conventional language can carry conventional meaning. But these colored modalities are like a hyperdimensional language, or what I call a visible language. And when we talk about language, we say things like, I see what you mean, or he told a really colorful story, or she's such a colorful speaker. In other words, we reach for visual metaphors to indicate linguistic clarity. And in Spanish, same thing. You say claro means it's clear. Das ist klar.
Wouldn't that refer to what the linguistic evokes in the hearing, which may be color?
Well, somehow we associate understanding with visual definition. And so it seems to me that probably language is an evolutionary process that is only partially complete. And what put me on to this, interestingly, is these songs that are sung in the Amazon on ayahuasca. The people take ayahuasca, they gather in darkened rooms and huts. Then the shamans sing. Then they pause to smoke and take a leak. And then you hear people saying stuff like, commenting on the song, I liked the part with the orange stripes and the metallic rippling, but I thought the olive drab and yellow section was just too twee. What kind of a criticism of a song is this? It's a criticism of a painting, not a song. And then you realize, aha, the song is a painting. I'm the only one in the room listening to the song. Everyone else that is born in the acoustical domain, but seeks to grow and mature into the domain of the visually beheld. Now, I always thought, perhaps you did too, that telepathy meant you hear what I think. I hear what you think. I don't think that's what telepathy is. Telepathy is you see what I mean. You see what I mean. And a great communicator can make you see what they mean. And what's happening is your evolutionary ability to process language is being brought right to the edge. Well, then this whole thing is running on brain chemistry, serotonergic chemistry, chemistry not that different from the chemistry of the psychedelic experience. You change these brain chemicals around, and according to McLuhan and other students of communication and media, how we process language is actually not a biologically determined thing. It's a culturally determined thing. We hear speech because we live inside a print-created modality. Before print, people's heads were filled with very different stuff in the act of communicating. And so I don't know how it would work, but I can see we need a special form of communication. Perhaps we can do it with drugs, modified ayahuascas of some sort, or perhaps we can do it with virtual reality. If you think about virtual reality for a moment, it's a very tortuous, low-speed technology, but the end result of it is you see what I mean. I go away for 6 months, animate, texture, embed all this stuff in VRML brackets and everything, and then I say, here's, that hallucination I described to you 6 months ago? Now I'd like to show it to you. Here it is. Now do you see what I mean? And of course you see what is meant, because unlike acoustically modulated speech, where there is this necessity for congruent dictionaries, when something has a three-dimensional modality, no dictionary is necessary. In other words, when you and I, if I read a paragraph from Proust, then we could spend an hour discussing, as you all have in lit class, I'm sure, what did the author mean? We discuss it. But if I show you a sculpture, we see what the author meant. There may be ambiguity, but it's at a different level. The intent of the artist is beheld with perfect clarity. The intent of the artist was to build this unambiguous object. Words are always clothed in ambiguity because no two people define a word the same way. Where, I have a certain amount of faith that when we look at this thing, you the Jew, you the Christian, you the smart person, you the dumb person, you the Buddhist, we all still see the same glass. But if I were to describe it, then, ideology would amalgamate and compromise it. Yeah.
What about other types of meaning that aren't conveyable through this kind of a language? Because you have, I'm trying to think of something that I can't really think of a good example other than like a woman having some kind of perfume on, and she's that's a meaning that she's wearing that scent. or something like this, that other senses, and that's conveying meaning. How do you bring that into this kind of language?
Well, we experience other meanings than acoustical in the present world. Works of art which are static. I don't think a visible language will replace all other forms of language, but I certainly think that if perfected, it would become the dominant modality. See, I think that language, that it's hard for us to talk about this issue in English because there's a stupid thing going on in English, which is the word language is used interchangeably with speech. We should have a vocabulary that always distinguishes whether we are speaking of language, the abstract notion of communication, or acoustical speech. Language is very, very old in human beings, in nature. Honeybees do it, dolphins do it, birds do it, bees do it, everybody does it. Verbal speech was invented yesterday by somebody in Africa, no less than 40,000 years ago. It's as artificial as the bicycle pump or the espresso machine. It's not part of the animal body. It's not part of the animal heritage. We communicated for 1 million years without verbal speech. We grunted, we groaned, we shook each other, we looked in each other's eyes, we pointed, we danced, we memed, we did all these things. Granted, these are low bandwidth forms of communication. Well, then the evolution of media reached a point where some genius thought of coding, the key concept. He said, I'll make the sound orange, and when I make that sound, you think of the fruit. Now let's try it. Orange. Picture of fruit appears. Okay, now let's not do it for 24 hours. Now we'll try it 24 hours later. Orange, the fruit appeared. Say, what an interesting game. And it was simply a game. It was, and then once invented, its obvious utility caused it to spread like the growth of the internet. First of all, it worked in darkness, speech. And it was a dark world, the Paleolithic, Suddenly people didn't have to go to bed at nighttime. They could talk. They could tell stories. It also it is the first one-to-many form of media. Politics is born. Speeches can now be given. And people can, large collective enterprises can be undertaken. But it's a tool. It's a technology, perhaps the most successful technology ever put in place. I mean, what a trick. You just use your throat muscles and the ambient air, and then a lot of coding. There's a huge amount of code behind it. Not only the definitions of all these words, but the syntactical connections, the grammar, all of that makes it work. And with the invention of language, somehow we cross out of the animal mind, the invention of speech, I'm sorry, my own error, as I stated. With the invention of speech, then somehow we cross out of the domain of the animal mind, and speech accelerates all other forms of cultural change. I mean, it's like supercharging the cultural system, and it leads instantly in geological time to religion, science, philosophy, and further adumbrations of the communication enterprise. The next great leap being writing and reading. And if you analyze writing and reading, they are not the same thing as speaking, but they are hellaciously complicated behaviors which human beings can be taught to do. And, people say dolphins communicate and dolphins have speech and honeybees and this and that, but no one has been nuts enough to dare to claim that they read and write. In that domain, we stand preeminent on this planet. Dolphins do not read or write. And so what is writing? Well, writing is the symbolic downloading of sound into a visible domain. So suddenly, again, the program of visible language. Writing is an intermediate phase between, VR by thought and simple animal or primitive human speech. But again, the path forward is clearly by pushing the communication process toward the visible. Once we can write things down, history becomes possible. The database of the species can be expanded beyond the memory capacity of single individuals. And again, an enormous kick in the rear end for progress, variability, so forth and so on. So when you analyze the acceleration into history and the technological forces that have driven it, it's always been about accelerating the communication process and making it more visually immediate. And, now with the ability to understand this, we're also potentially able to do something about it by actually directing the evolution of communication technology in this direction. Yeah.
Can I just get one question before we break? I've always been confused about this. When you say that we can better communicate without language, what about art forms like poetry or, Shakespeare, where the point is, what it's about is the words? And they get to a point where you can say they're words, but they're not words in the same sense as a laundry list is, because they're infused with grace. What about, it seems like language can do some things and some things that a picture couldn't do.
Oh, yeah. I think, yes, that art, it will be an art, It always has been an art. But art flourishes under limitation. Sort of like, take black and white photography. Given that it's tremendously limited as a medium, black and white and two-dimensional, still black and white photography can move us to tears, can be as deeply and enriching and communicating as any imaginable experience of communication, but only in the hands of a master. For most of us, I think it's better to move up the ladder of fidelity and bandwidth simply because we need all the help we can get. Well, we blew through 2 hours at the speed of light. I hope this was useful to you. We'll get together this evening at 8 o'clock right here, and it will be completely different. Thank you.